What's going on, everyone? My name is Mark and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel for the first time. Now today, I'll be showing you all something that is slightly out of my imagination, as the only instances where stasis tubes are shown in Ridley Scott's Alien series, they usually either contain facehuggers or humans, but never chestbursters, until today. As always, I have annotated in the video description where the STLs for both the Stasis Tube parts and the Xenomorph Chestburster can be downloaded. I also want to mention that the models that are being presented on screen have been rescaled and reworked to tailor my needs. Originally, the Stasis Tube STLs were scaled to the size that they were presented in the films, but for the purposes of this project, the Chestburster, printed at 100%, fits perfectly inside of a 4.4-inch diameter cylinder glass, which is what the Stasis Tube top and bottom sections were scaled to fit around. If you want to print it the exact size that I did, for all of the cylindrical parts underneath the scaling tab in Cura, make sure that the uniform scaling box is checked and set the X-axis to 137mm. The Y and Z axes will reset automatically while keeping everything proportionally accurate. Before getting started, I'll note that with as much detail that there was on this Chestburster model, I knew that I didn't want to sand too heavily, but I still wanted to get rid of as many layer lines as possible. I still started with 80 grit sandpaper as I normally do, but I didn't apply nearly as much pressure as I would on a helmet print. As for the Stasis Tube top and bottom, that was quite the opposite. Since the inside of the tube housing is going to contain the power source for the RGB LEDs, I applied some aluminum tape to the top side of the electronics access panel to act as heat shielding for the plastic. When all of the parts were sanded, it was time to spray them all down with Sandable primer. I've also forgotten to mention that upon pursuing this project, a friend did reach out to me requesting that I make them a stasis tube. They saw my prototype from my YouTube short, and were beyond excited for me to get started on one for them. The next two steps can be hypothetically repeated indefinitely in the effort of covering up every single layer line. Personally, I only had to rinse and repeat once, but if you're not happy with how your prints look, you can always go longer. Also, keep in mind that sometimes imperfections that were left behind can be worked into the final product. When you're ready to break the monotony of spraying primer and sanding, then you can move into spraying with gloss black paint, and more sanding, but with 600 grit sandpaper instead. And similar to the primer stage, I'll usually spray the model a few different times and sand with 600 before following up with metallics, as was the case for this project. To begin painting the Chestbursters, I sprayed them down with a nice even coat of beige spray paint. With a detail brush, all of the recessed areas of the model were filled in with acrylic flamenco red. Although this is not the most canonically accurate representation of a Chestburster, I'm certain that most of you understand that it's okay to color in the duck blue sometimes because you've never seen a blue duck before and you really wanted to see a blue duck. Moving forward, I began by giving these little guys that fresh out of the chest look with a thorough red wash, followed by a blue wash in order to achieve an overall purple hue. Finally, I finished up with a green wash, as you most likely would see hints of this color during the early stages of the Xenomorph's development, eventually leading to its final stage in metamorphosis when its body is considerably much darker. Also, I'll point out that I allowed some of the red wash to run down the Chestburster's mouth, making it look like he just took a bite out of somebody. Since the plan for this model was to be completely submerged in water, I mixed up some clear acrylic resin, coating the entire outside surface of these models. This will prevent deterioration of the paint over time, as well as enhancing the vibrancy of the overall paint job. By showing all of you a second close-up of the model post-resin, I hope this illustrates just how much of a difference the added resin made to the overall finish. If you feel up to it, let me know in the comments section what you think. Since the cylinder glass that I used for this project didn't have any kind of bottom to it, I had to fabricate one. To do this, I used a 1/4 inch thick acrylic sheet. This material is easy to drill into, and the inside bottom of the tank was going to later be sealed with clear acrylic resin, making this acrylic sheet the perfect material choice. And of course there's the bubbling effect that I wanted to achieve with this prop. Make sure to note that although the footage shows that I installed a 1/4 inch black rubber grommet, I eventually moved up to a 3/8 inch grommet instead. In order to effectively seal anything with resin, it's best practice to scuff that area first, as it establishes grooves that the resin can later sink down into. To begin sealing the tank, I first tacked the acrylic disc that I cut out into place with gel superglue and superglue activator, followed by a bead of superglue around the contour of the disc, filling in any potential leak points. Then I mixed up some more clear resin and poured a 1/4 inch thick layer into the bottom of the tank. I was a bit weary about pouring too much resin and causing it to overflow and spill out through the grommet. Focusing on the already adhered alien, you can see how this is going to be set up. Both the alien and the 1-inch air stone on the end of the air pump hose were both adhered to the bottom of the tank with 5-minute epoxy, which bonds very well with acrylic resin. Moving forward, I can say that I'm glad that I made 2 of these for this video, so I could provide you with a glimpse of what the housing bottom setup will look like once it's finished. Notably, we have reached the most intricate part of this video. I wanted to have a cost-effective RGB light option, so I went with this USB-powered light strip. I picked it up at Walmart for about $10. I first made sure that the infrared remote sensor was oriented so it could stick out of one of the already existing holes on the side of the housing bottom. Then I carefully adhered the light strip in a circular fashion with plenty of hot glue, creating this wall of insulation between the LEDs and the PLA plastic. I'm not saying that the LEDs could get hot enough to warp the plastic, but they do certainly generate heat, and now they're within a small enclosed area layered upon themselves, so an added wall of insulation certainly would not hurt. Speaking of heat shielding, let's focus back on the bottom access panel for just a moment. Also, you may think this setup is weird, but try to bear with me. This Apple power block will be what the LEDs plug into once power is run to it. So, if you haven't figured it out yet, I will be wiring an additional circuit borrowing power from the 120 volt current within the inside of the pump's power plug. This would occur in the plug circuit prior to the pump's voltage reference, so as long as it's before the circuit board, this should work. To begin wiring, the first thing that I wanted to do was open up the wall plug housing to get a better look at what I was working with. Also, in my experience with small electronics like this pump, I find it beneficial to glue down wiring that's coming off of the circuit board to prevent excessive bending of those wires, which may eventually cause them to break off. For any wiring that's leading into the housing bottom, I installed a 3/8 inch diameter black rubber grommet which will prevent friction against the rubber sheathing on the outside of the wires. Another idea that I had was to include an on-off switch for the pump, but in order for this to work, I had to retroactively include a hole that would accommodate the diameter of the switch so it could be installed. I will say that my hole placement could have been a little better. The bottom prong, as shown, was slightly difficult to run wiring through. Next, it was time to mount the air pump into place. For this, I used hot glue. By scoring the side of the pump that was to be glued into the inside of the housing, I was hopeful that the adhesion was strong, preventing it from ever breaking loose, especially for a component that's going to constantly vibrate. The wiring harness for the pump was then run through the 3/8 inch diameter black rubber grommet from earlier. Then the positive and negative leads were rejoined, soldered, separated, and insulated with heat shrink tubing. After this step was complete, it was time to move back over to the wall plug so I could begin wiring in circuits for both the pump's on-off switch and to power the LEDs. To help the audience differentiate between which circuit is which, the green wires that I'm adding will be run to the pump's on-off switch, while the thicker red wires will carry the 120 volt current coming off of the power outlet to the Apple power block. And of course, just like before, any wires that were soldered together were insulated with heat shrink tubing. Once everything was wired correctly on this end, my next challenge was making sure that I could package up all of this added wiring neatly and run it down the length of the wiring harness back towards the housing bottom through a 3/8 inch diameter hole that was already partially filled by another wire and then soldered into place. Hopefully, that description really puts into perspective just how close the wiring portion of this video is in coming to an end. Notably, if I had used a thinner gauge of wire from what I did use, I wouldn't have had as hard of a time getting everything to fit through a 3/8 inch grommet. In order to get both of the wires for the on-off switch to fit through both of the prongs, I had to rotate the switch temporarily at roughly 45 degrees to provide clearance for the bottom prong, as mentioned earlier. Finally, I found myself at the final stage of wiring, which was to solder the 120 volt leads directly onto the prongs coming off of the Apple power block. And just like the majority of my solder points on this project, I insulated the wire ends with more heat shrink tubing. Next, I had to connect the check valve to the pump and then glue the check valve into place. Also, I had to make sure that the tubing that was coming off of the check valve was at the appropriate length to meet up with the tubing that was coming off of the glass tank. One way to determine this is by making sure that the connected tank sits inside of the housing bottom, and then question whether or not the tubing between the check valve and the bottom of the tank is kinking up. It may take some trial and error in order to get the length just right. But when you get everything neatly packaged up and you're ready to move forward, this would be an appropriate time to perform another bench test. Truthfully, I allowed the LEDs and the pump in tandem with each other to run for a couple of days before shutting it off, just to make sure that I didn't have any leaks, and also to ensure that this project did not possess the ability to burn somebody's house down. Needless to say, I'm happy to report that I didn't run into any issues of that sort, deeming my wiring job and the sealing of the tank successful. In celebration of that, let's allow the Chestburster to have a rave moment. To continue, I began assembling the housing tops, adding a couple of static on-off switches just for looks. Adding actual metal parts to this model really added a layer of detail that I feel has very much made this prop much more convincing. In comparison to my prototype, I'm especially pleased with the now proportionally accurate air hose coupler. The original coupler that I used would have worked perfectly if I had printed these models at their original proportions, but for the smaller representation of this model, an airbrush air hose coupler worked just fine. Setting up the threaded rods were fairly self-explanatory, as all I had to do was cut 3 separate but equal sections of the threaded rod to the appropriate length and then thread everything into place. As for the housing bottom, the hardware was moderately tightened, while the hardware on the housing top was, and always will remain, finger tight. Once this was completed, I was finally able to move on to my absolute favorite portion of this project. There's just something about adding an accurate looking asset tag and a Weyland-Yutani Corporation logo to this project that just sets it off. And of course, the Etsy stores that offered these products receive full credit. So, if you want to make something that is Weyland-Yutani related, definitely pay these Etsy stores an honest visit. I then moved into one of the final 2 remaining steps in finishing this project. With a modest amount of superglue, I adhered a metal eye screw hook into place located on the top of the housing top. Since I had just run out of superglue activator, I gave that plenty of time to set. Finally, I cut out a circle of toolbox drawer liner that was roughly the diameter of the bottom of the Stasis Tube housing. Then I simply applied it to the bottom of the housing with superglue. Toolbox drawer liner seems to stick to any flat surface that it rests upon, so for an electronic tank filled with water, I thought that a little bit of traction would not hurt. And aside from trimming off the excess material with an X-Acto knife, that pretty much wraps up this video. So go ahead and give the video all of the love and praise that you think it deserves. I hope you'll join me next time, and as always, thanks for watching.